You're watching LaRouche Pack's Saturday Evening Class series. Tonight's the third in the series on Dante by Robert Ingram. The subject is how Dante launched the Renaissance. And I think many of you will be watching tonight with the question of how do we launch the Renaissance that's needed today. So, Bob, shoot.
Okay. Hi, folks. Well, we're just going to jump right into it. There are two very short preliminary things I want to mention. One is in the area of self-promotion. All of the material from these three classes is taken from this article. I don't know if you can read it. Dante Alighieri and the New Paradigm for Human Culture, which is in this book, Hidden in Plain Sight, which also has a pretty good article on Machiavelli. And this is available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo. So you can purchase that if you so desire. The second thing is I just wanted to mention that I had stated in the class last week that it was extraordinarily difficult to write poetry in English. I mean, you could do it, but poetry that sounds poetic, that actually works. Extremely difficult to write poetry in English using Dante's terza rima rhyme and construction scheme. And that is the case. And most people who have tried to do it have really not succeeded. But a friend pointed out to me that there is one wonderful exception to that, that comment, which is that one of the greatest poems in the English language, written by Percy Shelley, the Ode to the West Wind, is written rigorously in Dante's terza rima method. So that just goes to show what you can do, what can be done in the hands of a great poet. So that said, that out of the way, yes, the discussion of tonight is, how do you take a society which is experiencing a devastating crisis, a devastating collapse, moral, cultural, economic decay and collapse into catastrophe, and how from that, not only do you rescue that society, but you create something better. You create a better future than what even existed before the crisis. And that's what we're going to discuss tonight, from the standpoint of Dante. So the way I'm going to begin this is just by painting a very brief picture of the nature of this collapse and crisis that occurred in the 14th century. It began even before Dante's death. Dante died in 1321, and beginning around 1315 or so, in the closing years of his life, what is called the Great Famine struck Europe, all of Europe, including Italy. And it went on for a number of years, 5, 6, 7, 8 years, in which food disappeared, starvation spread. The estimate today is that between 10 and 20% of the population of Europe died. This is before the Black Death. This is from the famine. Life expectancy dropped from, these are all estimates because no one really knows the exact figures, but as best as can be determined, life expectancy dropped from 35 years old, which was the life expectancy back then. It dropped from 35 years old at the beginning of the famine to 29 years old at the end of the famine. And then in 1337, only a short while afterwards, but this is after Dante's death. In 1337, the 100 Years' War broke out. And this was not one war, it was a series of wars which lasted for 116 years. Now, primarily, the main body of the warfare was between the ruling families, not really nation states, but ruling oligarchical families of France and England. But it was not restricted to them. This warfare spread throughout Europe. You think 116 years, with a life expectancy of 29 years old, you're talking about 4 to 5 generations, living through this extended period of warfare and destruction and death. Then in 1345, most of the Lombard banking system collapsed, came crashing down. This was the usurious, oligarchical private banking system of the Middle Ages. And most of the major banking houses went bankrupt, including the Bardi, the Peruzzi, the Frescobaldi, the Accioli, if I'm pronouncing that right, which had this vast network of loans and debt, and an enormous financial burden all over Europe, not just in Italy. And this came crashing down in 1345. 2 years after the collapse of these banking houses in 1347, the Black Death arrived in Europe. It struck Florence in 1348, the following year, and it lasted for about 2 years in Florence, 1348, 1349, during which well over half the population of Florence died. And most estimates say that it was between 2/3 and 3/4 of the population died. And this was true not only in Florence, but all of the cities and towns and villages throughout northern Italy, as well as the rest of Europe. Just massive devastation. So this was the collapse. This was the crisis, and in many ways, there's been, well, in almost every way, there has been nothing like this, since that time until today. It came at the point, of a more than a century of financial and economic looting of Europe, by the Lombard banking houses, by the papacy, by the oligarchical Angevin rulers in France and England and elsewhere, all leading up to this crisis of 1348. So you have to, you can look at our own time and look at the economic and moral ruin of our nation today. But recognize that we have not yet experienced what occurred, in the middle of the 14th century. Not yet. Bodies lying all over the street, no one there to bury them, death everywhere, disease everywhere, nothing functioning, people starving, no food being, grown or harvested. You're looking at literally a situation in which to the people living within it, it seems like the world is coming to an end. And you see that in some of the paintings from that period. How did they get out of that? how do you rise from that kind of a situation? And really, the argument that I'm putting forward tonight is that it was the mind of Dante, which really lighted the path into the future. And I'm going to talk about a little bit about two men who played a key role in this. One is a man named Giotto di Bondone, the famous painter and also architect, and then the writer Boccaccio. Giotto and Dante were lifelong friends. They worked very closely together. They were about the same age, but Giotto lived quite a bit longer than Dante. I mean, they were together as early as 1305 in Podesta, city of Podesta, where Giotto was painting his very famous frescoes at the Podesta Chapel, the city of Bargello, I think you pronounce it. Excuse me. That I'm mistaken. I have this backwards. They were in Padua, not in Podesta. They were in Padua, where Giotto was painting his frescoes at the Scrovegni Chapel. These are very famous frescoes. They're considered Giotto's masterpiece. That was in 1305. Later, they were together, Giotto and Dante, in Verona with Calagrande della Scala, who I talked about in the first class. And later, they were together again in Ravenna towards the end of Dante's life with Gino Novello da Polenta, who I talked about in the first class. They had a lifelong collaboration. And in the Purgatory, Dante praises Giotto by name as the greatest of painters. So this was their relationship. Now, what happened is that in 1337, 16 years after Dante's death, now this is after the Black Death, the plague, about, I don't know, no, this is still before the Black Plague. I'm sorry, folks. But in 1337, about 16 years after Dante's death, Giotto was given a commission to paint a fresco, and this was the fresco in Podesta. He was given a commission to paint a fresco at the headquarters of the Florentine government. They had a city council and a government headquarters, and in that building they had a chapel, because most official buildings at that time had chapels. And he was given a commission to paint a fresco in the chapel, and he painted a fresco of paradise. Now, what he did is that in the center of that fresco, he put Dante. Now, remember, this is 16 years after Dante's death. The Black Wealths are still ruling Florence. The death sentence, even though he's already dead, the death sentence against Dante is still in effect. His works are being banned and burned by papal agents. But in the center of paradise, in this fresco in Florence, Giotto puts Dante right at the center. And what I'd like to do is put up the first three pictures, Tony.
Okay.
And I'll just say a little bit about them. All right, this is Giotto, a statue of him at the Uffizi. He's not. It's a pretty. He actually, if you think this is not a good statue of him, not very complimentary, one thing you should know is that during his lifetime, he was considered by everyone who knew him to be extraordinarily ugly, which was, one of the things he had to live with. But this is a statue of Giotto. Put up the next one. This is a section, a detail of the fresco of Paradise. And you could see towards the left, not at the very left, but towards the left, standing up, is someone in a dark red cloak and red hat. That's Dante. Go to the next one. And this is a detail of that detail, a close-up of that detail, where you see Dante right in the center. So this is, you could take that down. This is what Giotto paints. Now, I want to just show you a couple of things, because I want to give you a little bit of a sense of who Giotto was and the importance of him. Many people in this class here tonight, this discussion, may not be all that familiar with medieval art or Byzantine art from the Byzantine Empire, but it's extraordinarily two-dimensional, flat. You're not really looking at pictures of people. You're looking almost at icons, very lifeless. Giotto was, he intervened into that in the way Dante intervened. People who see a Giotto fresco often say, well, it's very lifelike, but it's more than just lifelike. What he's doing is he's really looking into the soul of people, the way Dante does in the Commedia. He's looking into, he's treating people as cognitive human beings, people with souls. So I want to show these next two pictures. These are both from frescoes by Giotto. No, the next one.
Not this one?
This one. I'm not sure where these frescoes are from. I didn't write it down. But this is one, obviously, of the crucifixion. Nothing like this had ever been painted before in terms of, what you're seeing here. And go to the next one. And this is from another fresco. And you can see you're looking at real human beings. You're looking at people. If you look at the eyes, there's also perspective, which is much different from Byzantine art. But besides the perspective, you're looking into the soul of these people. And this is what Giotto was doing. Or you could take that down. Now, Giotto lived to 1337. And he lived to 1337. And in the closing years of his life, I'm not sure when they first met, but in the closing years of his life, he became acquainted with a very young Boccaccio, who was then in his 20s. And Boccaccio became sort of his protege. And they spent hours together, over a period of, several years. They spent hours together discussing Dante, discussing the Commedia, they became very close. And from the moment of his relationship with Giotto, Boccaccio becomes, the only way to describe it is he becomes the champion of Dante. Boccaccio never knew Dante. Dante died before he was born. He died when he was a very young child. Boccaccio takes up the banner of Dante, and this becomes his life mission. He lived to 1375, and for decades, he became the voice for Dante in Florence and throughout Italy. His first published work of poetry, something called Filocolo, which he wrote in 1336 when he was 23 years old, is modeled directly on Dante's La Vita Nuova. And then in the course of his writings during the 1330s, 1340s, there are constant references to Dante, and examples of poetry modeled on Dante. In 1342, Boccaccio published a poem called Amorosa Visione, which is the vision of love. I'm probably mispronouncing the Italian, but the English title of this poem is The Vision of Love, which he wrote and published in 1342. And this was modeled directly on the comedy, on the Divine Comedy, directly on it. It contained 50 cantos, all in Dante's Terza Rima. And in the poem, Boccaccio praises both Dante and Giotto by name as standing above all other artists, ancient or modern. And he calls Dante the Lord of all knowledge. Now, as I said, you have this is all, before the Black Death. Now, the plague hit Florence, 1348, 1349, and in 1353, Boccaccio publishes the Decameron, which is the thing he's most famous for, and some people might have read it. And really, the way I look at the Decameron is it's sort of the counterpart to Dante's Inferno, because if you look at Dante's Inferno, I mean, what is he doing? He is condemning, a lot of the aristocracy of Florence, of the papacy, and others, for their sins, for their evil appetites. And if you look at the Decameron, what is Boccaccio doing? This is a story of people gathered together during the plague. And, what Boccaccio does is he holds up the sins and the follies, of these aristocrats to ridicule. The Decameron, Boccaccio uses humor. As anyone knows who's read it, it's funny as hell. The Decameron, Boccaccio uses humor, but it's a biting humor in which he is exposing the absolute folly of the culture of this class of people, which led to the predicament they're now in, which is hiding out, to prevent themselves from, being killed by the plague. 4 years after the Decameron, in 1357, Boccaccio published The Life of Dante, Vita de Dante. And this hit Florence, like a thunderbolt when this was published. Now, what Boccaccio actually had done is he talked to everyone he could find who personally knew Dante during his life. Now, he had been on intimate terms with Giotto, and he also was very close friends. Boccaccio was very close friends with Dante's nephew, a man named Andrea Poggi, and another of Dante's close friends, Dino Perini. Boccaccio knew all of these extremely well. And he also made 2 visits to Ravenna, where Dante had died, and talked to people in Ravenna, including Dante's daughter, Antonia, as well as a man named Piero Giardino, who was one of Dante's most devoted friends during the final years of Dante's life. And Boccaccio talked to all of these people, spent hours with them, and from that composed his life of Dante. And this, as I said, was published in Florence in 1357. Boccaccio. Also, what I will say is that, last week, and I'm going to talk a lot more about it tonight. Last week we talked about Dante's use of the vernacular and really the creation of the modern Italian language. Both during Dante's lifetime, he came under massive attack from this. But then after his death, people tried to bury this. I mean, and I'm not going to, I actually know a fair amount about this, and it'd take too long to go into all the details, but there was a concerted campaign, to bury the use of the vernacular, to reverse what Dante had done, to insist that Latin was the only language that would be used for, works of science, philosophy, religion, mathematics, poetry, that they were not going to allow this intervention, what Dante had done, to continue or to grow, to flourish. And if you look at the 1340s, 1350s, 1360s, 1370s, Boccaccio almost single-handedly, almost single-handedly waged a war on behalf of Dante's vernacular. Everything he wrote, not everything, he wrote a few things, but all of his major works are in the vernacular, all of them. And he was in battles with people all the time. And I'll give you one example, which might surprise people, but Boccaccio waged a years-long battle. I wouldn't call it, you could call it a feud, but it wasn't really a feud. It was a battle over principle with Petrarch. Now, some people really love Petrarch, and I'm not going to discuss Petrarch's poetry. He's generally, whenever people talk about the Renaissance, they talk about Petrarch. But what you may not be aware of is that Petrarch was vehemently, and I mean vehemently, opposed to the use of the vernacular, tried to stamp it out. He put enormous pressure on Boccaccio to abandon the vernacular, writing him letter after letter. And I've read a lot of these letters saying, you're debasing yourself, you're degrading yourself, no one will accept you, abandon this filthy vernacular and write in Latin. And all of Petrarch's so-called beautiful poetry is written in Latin. But the reality is, the way history books write about this is that Petrarch was this polished Latin scholar who wrote this beautiful poetry in Latin. And Boccaccio was sort of, not quite as erudite, not quite as, polished, more primitive than Petrarch. But look, the reality is the opposite. Petrarch was writing for the past. Boccaccio was writing for the future. And one of the people who was enormously influenced by Boccaccio was Geoffrey Chaucer, the author of the Canterbury Tales. He had written poetry and written a number of things in English, what was in, what we call today Middle English, but it was English, when he was younger. But then as an adult, he made 2 visits to Italy, which transformed him. He read Dante. He read the Commedia. He described Dante as the great poet of Italy. He devoured the writings of Boccaccio. And when he came back to England, there was a great change in his writing, a great change. There was, in terms of the development of the grammar, the invention of new words, the use of metaphor, the richness of the language. If you look at some of his major works, The Knight's Tale, which is a portion of the Canterbury Tales, is derived directly from Boccaccio's poem, Tacite, I think. Well, I might be mispronouncing that. And Chaucer's work, Troilus and Cressida, is based on Boccaccio's poem Il Filostrato. Chaucer studied the works of Boccaccio intensively. And out of this, this immersion of Chaucer in both Dante and Boccaccio, really the modern English language is born as a written language in the English vernacular. And obviously today it's Middle English and people say you can't read it, but you can read it. If you try, but there would have been no Shakespeare without Chaucer, who created this vernacular language. So let's get back to this question of rising from the collapse, rebuilding society at a point of catastrophe. Now, the plague had basically worked its way through Florence by the end of 1349. 2 years later, as the prospect existed of what do we do now? How do we rebuild? 2 years later, in 1351, a decision was made by the government of Florence to restart construction on the Cathedral of Florence. This is the famous Cathedral Santa Maria del Fiore. Now that cathedral had actually been started much earlier in 1296, but it didn't get very far. The original they started it, but the original architect died, and construction stopped for like 30 or 40 years. Then in the 1330s, they restarted construction, and the person who was put in charge at that time of restarting the construction on the cathedral was Giotto. He was the person in charge of restarting the construction on the cathedral. But then Giotto died, the construction languished somewhat, and then the Black Death hit, and all construction stopped during the catastrophe. In 1351, they construction restarted, and it went on, and over a period of years. 1 year after construction started, Boccaccio published the Decameron. And then as construction of the cathedral continues, in the midst of that, Boccaccio publishes his Life of Dante. Then two great interventions, you could call them miraculous interventions, but two great interventions occur. In 1367, they've reached a certain level of construction of the cathedral, but there is a big debate on what to do next, how to continue. And they have a committee or a commission. I don't know exactly everyone who was involved. They asked people to submit ideas, bids, plans, various architects on how they're going to move forward, how they're going to complete this cathedral. And the plan that is adopted, this is in 1367, the plan that is adopted was submitted by a man named Neri di Fioravanti. And it was really shocking what he proposed, because originally, if you go back to 1296 and even some of the construction that went on early in the 14th century, the cathedral was going to be sort of on the Gothic design, what we like cathedrals that were being built elsewhere at that time. And I'll show you a couple of pictures later on to show you the difference, but not right now. But in the plan submitted by Neri di Fioravanti, he abandons completely the Gothic design, including the use of buttresses to support the cathedral. And I'll show you some pictures of them later on. And what he proposes is the creation of a giant octagon on which will be built a massive inner dome, and that dome will then be covered by a thin outer dome. And he puts forward this design. And in my mind, one way to look at it, is this was revolutionary. Revolutionary is an understatement. The way I look at it, and people might take exception to this, is that just as Dante had sort of relegated Latin to the dustbin, with the Commedia and his other writings, just as he had relegated Latin to something from the past, what Fioravanti did in abandoning the Gothic cathedral design was to relegate that to the past and to say, no, we're going to build something entirely new, entirely different. Now, the problem was that he submitted this model with this giant dome. I think he actually built a little model with this giant dome, and his model was accepted. And he was hired, to head up the construction of the cathedral. The problem was that the dome he envisioned, that he announced was going to, be on top of this cathedral, that no one knew how to build it, including him. He said, this is what we're going to build, but he had no idea how to build it. And most people who were alive at that time thought it was impossible to build such a dome. But this is, Nevertheless, this is what they set out to do. And they began building up the walls and the base and the various apses and naves of the cathedral, basically leaving the dome to the future. That at some point, somewhere in the future, someone is going to have to make a creative discovery which will allow for this dome to be built. So they're building away at the future, leaving building away at the cathedral, leaving the building of the dome to the future. So that begins in 1367, and then work starts up. And 1367, 68, 69 into the 1370s, they're building the cathedral. Then in 1373, I said there were two great interventions. The first was the adoption of the plan to build this domed cathedral. Then in 1373, 6 years after, this model had been adopted, in 1373, Boccaccio received a commission from the people building the cathedral. They were called the priors of the guilds. So I guess this is sort of like primitive, 14th century trade unions, guilds, building guilds. The people building the cathedral, he received a commission to give a year of public lectures on Dante's Commedia. Daily lectures. In other words, every day, to give a series of lectures. These were readings. He would read sections from the comedy, from the Inferno, from Purgatorio, from Paradiso. He would read sections of them, and then he would give lectures on them. And in the audience, these were given at the Santo Stefano Church in Florence. And as I said, they were daily lectures. And in the audience are people from all walks of life, from the Florentine aristocracy, from the church, but also the people working on the cathedral, the architects, the planners, the workmen, the laborers are taking part in these lectures. And this went on for 100 days, about 3.5 months. And then Boccaccio had to withdraw because of ill health. He died 2 years later. He was elderly when he did this. He died 2 years later. But, as this cathedral is being built, you have daily lectures being given by Boccaccio on the Commedia. And you have people from throughout Florence flocking to these lectures, so that the mind of Dante, is influencing everything. The cantos are being read, and then people who are hearing them read are going back to work to build this cathedral. So what happened next is that in 1418, they got to the point where the church was more or less built, and the only thing left was to build the dome. And again, they had a competition. Various architects submitted plans, and there was, some conflict over it. But ultimately, Filippo Brunelleschi was given the contract to build the dome, and no one knew how he was going to build it. The thing about this is, not only was this the biggest dome ever built, but it was completely unsupported. And not only was it unsupported in the sense that there were no beams holding it up, or anything like that, but in building it, there were no supports. In other words, back then, if you were going to build, any tall building, really tall building, which had high ceilings, 30, 40, 50, 100 feet up in the air, like if you were going to build another kind of cathedral, even if it didn't have a dome, it might have, the cathedral might go up numerous stories. And the way it was built was with, a lattice work of platforms and construction. They'd build platforms and work on it, and then build the platforms higher and work on it. And they build their way up with all this supporting infrastructure. And the Brunelleschi didn't do that. There were no support beams and no supporting platforms to build it. And to this day, a lot of people really don't know how he built it. Now, what Lyndon LaRouche always insisted was that the key to the building of the dome was the catenary curve. And the catenary curve is a principle of physical space. It's a type of curve. It's not a parabolic curve. It's not a hyperbolic curve. It's not a circular curve. It's based on the principle of the hanging chain, but it's a very specific kind of curve. And LaRouche, argued very strongly that it was really Brunelleschi's discovery. I mean, he wasn't the first one to discover the catenary, but the discovery of the use of the catenary in creating this dome, that this was the principle that was involved, which had never before been used in construction. And so the building of this dome was not just this mammoth project, but it was not, like I said, when they said we're going to build it, they had no idea how it could be built. And it was built based on a discovery of a physical principle of a principle in the physical universe, of physical space, of how space is organized. That was the key to the creation of this dome. This was the greatest scientific project of the Renaissance, the greatest scientific achievement of the Renaissance. And it was built. So I want you to put up a few pictures now, Tony. We're going to look at about 5 pictures. Next one. This is Brunelleschi. That's just a statue of him. Go to the next one. All right. This is Notre Dame Cathedral. And you can see, these are what are called flying buttresses, those big support beams that are coming in from the outside, which basically hold up the walls. Because if you did not have those, the walls would collapse. And then go to the next one. And this is Chartres Cathedral, which is a lot of people consider the most beautiful Gothic cathedral. This also has flying buttresses, but you can't see them in this picture. But what you can see on the left side there are buttresses attached to the walls. I mean, they really are like flying buttresses, but they're close in, they're attached to the walls, and they're holding the walls up. So go to the next one. This is the Cathedral of Florence. And it's built without buttresses of any kind. And then you see the dome. On the left is the bell tower. That's Giotto's bell tower. He designed that bell tower and started construction on it before his death. He died while it was under construction. but then you see the dome, and you see that, you know, this phenomenal structure. You know, I mean, it was unlike, anything that had been built before. I mean, Brunelleschi had traveled to Rome on numerous occasions. He had, you can leave that up. He traveled to Rome on numerous occasions. He had studied Roman architecture. He made an intensive study of the Pantheon, which is the domed building, big dome building in Rome. But if you've ever been in the Pantheon and been in the Cathedral of Florence, and I've been in both, I mean, the Pantheon is literally barbaric compared to and primitive, extremely primitive, compared to the dome of the Florence Cathedral. I just show you one more picture for fun. That's my wife, Andrea, and she is standing on top of Giotto's bell tower, looking out over Brunelleschi's dome. Picture was taken, I think, in 1985. So turn out, we're going to look at one more picture later, not now. So, well, I could tell you, folks, we're going to go over here. And if we have to go over, I'll just tell the people running this, because I'm not in charge of the technical part. If we have to go over, and if that means we have to go over in terms of the questions and answers, we should just do it, because I really want to get through this. And there's a lot that I still have not gotten to. I know it's long. But, so Giotto, Boccaccio, Brunelleschi. What I want to turn to now, again, is this question of the vernacular. Some people might not think that this is the most critical issue, but in a lot of ways, it is of profound importance. Dante wrote two works on the vernacular. One was something called De Vulgari Eloquentia, which in English is on eloquence in the vernacular. And then he wrote on something called Convivio, which in English is the banquet. Now, what he says in writing about the vernacular in the Convivio is, he says, "This shall be the new light, the new sun, which shall rise when the worn out one shall set, and shall give light to them who are in the shadow and in darkness, because of the old sun, which does not enlighten them." So this is how he describes the vernacular, the new light, the new sun, which shall give light to them. I'm not going to say much about the Vulgari Eloquentia, but I want to really just focus on the Convivio. Dante never completed it. It was supposed to be like, 15 books or 18 books. He wrote this while he was on the run. After he had been condemned to death in Florence, he was moving from city to city. And, he found the time somehow to write 4 books of the Convivio, but he never completed it. He laid it down and never got back to it. It's much like La Vita Nuova. It's partially poetry and partially prose. Most of it is prose. It contains 3 long poems, what are called canzone, very musical, melodious poems, and then a great deal of prose. It's written in the form of a dialogue with lady philosophy, sort of modeled on what Boethius had done in the Consolation of Philosophy. Dante was had read and studied Boethius quite extensively when he was younger. And the whole subject of the Convivio is an argument in favor of the vernacular. And I'm going to read you some excerpts from it. He says, perfect generosity may be noted in three characteristics of the vernacular, which would not have been consequential in the use of Latin. The first is that of giving to many people. The second is that of giving things of use. The third is that of giving without being asked. To give to, and to assist one person is good, but perfect goodness is to give to and assist many, in that this resembles the beneficence of God, who is the universal benefactor. Latin would have failed to meet all three of the conditions mentioned above, all of which must be met for a gift to display complete generosity. And then another section, he says, I say that innate love moves the lover to do three things above all. First, to enhance the beloved object. Second, to be solicitous on its behalf. And third, to defend it, which happens continually, as anyone can observe. These three motives made me adopt the vernacular, which I love and have loved both innately and contingently. And then later, in discussing those who oppose the vernacular, and you can, if you're not too offended, you can think of Petrarch when you hear this, but he was by no means the only one or the worst one. In discussing those who oppose the vernacular, Dante says, all these groups taken together, those who oppose the vernacular, comprise the vile Italian wretches who despise this rich vernacular, which, if it is base in any way, is base only insofar as it issues from the meretricious lips of these adulterers by whom the blind are led. Dante begins book 2 and book 3 of the Convivio, both of these, with long, beautiful poems. The first one is, you who move the third heaven with an act of the intellect. And the second is, love who speaks to me within my mind. And reading the Convivio is really remarkable, because it's not simply an argument in favor of the vernacular. These poems are extraordinary, extremely beautiful. And what Dante is doing in writing this is he's creating the language. He's testing it. He's developing subtleties. He's developing the power to impart ideas of this language. He's literally creating the language as he is writing this. I'll skip that one, and I'll go to the one on where he's discussing the poem "Love Speaks Within My Mind," and he says, since this highest nature is called mind, I say in the canzone that love speaks within my mind, to make it clear that it is the love that springs from the noblest nature of truth and virtue, and to counter any false opinion regarding myself, that my love was aimed at sensual delight. Such is the first ineffable aspect of what I take for them in the canzone, and then I speak of the other when I say love's speech. I say that my thought that is love's word, sounds in me so sweetly that my soul, that is my affection, is on fire to speak it with my tongue. And because I cannot, I write that the soul therefore laments, saying that the tongue cannot reproduce completely what the intellect perceives. And I also say, my soul, which feels and hears him, that it hears the words and feels the sweetness of the sounds. And then in, book 4 of the Convivio begins with another canzone entitled Those Sweet Poems of Love, which I'm not going to really, discuss at length, except that what he does in this section, in the poem and in the section, is he's discussing the question of true human nobility. He contrasts what real human nobility, the nobility of the soul, the nobility of the intellect, the nobility of the heart, all encompassed in one, versus aristocratic nobility, hereditary nobility, as false nobility. It's really quite remarkable. Now, I know I'm running out of time, but there is something that I want to mention as just an anecdote to give you an idea of how this lived on after Dante. It's not the most important thing I'm going to discuss tonight, but I really want to bring it up. Brunelleschi's dome was completed in, I think, 1436. They added to it, and construction continued for about another 15 or 20 years. But the dome itself was completed in 1436. About 65 years later, you have Machiavelli. And Machiavelli, a truly great individual, despite what is said about him, was devoted to Dante. He lived after Dante, but he writes about him all the time. Machiavelli wrote a great deal of, not a great deal, but he wrote a significant amount of poetry. And the poetry is all modeled on Dante. Most of it is written in terza rima. And some of it is written in sonnets modeled on Dante's sonnet form. And then you see also in his discourses on Livy, Machiavelli's discourses on Livy, he takes up the question of Cincinnatus and the question of a republican citizenry. And this is taken directly from Dante's De Monarchia. And the discussion of Cincinnatus in Dante, in De Monarchia, is very similar, not exactly the same, but it's very similar to what Machiavelli raises in terms of how do you create a republican citizenry. This is what Machiavelli takes up. And the other individual I want to mention from that same period, Machiavelli's period, is Amerigo Vespucci, the navigator who, America is named after, who's also given a bad rap in history books. But the Vespucci family and the Machiavelli family knew each other intimately. They only lived a few blocks apart for generations. And Amerigo Vespucci and Machiavelli were actually part of the same political faction in Florence at that time. I don't think they knew each other because Vespucci was older. He moved to Spain at a certain point when Machiavelli was still young, but they were part of the same political faction in Florence. And Vespucci was also, who had studied under Toscanelli, was an admirer, a great admirer of Dante. And on one of his voyages, where he traveled down to South America, along the coast of South America, and went south of the equator, he was investigating, he was doing astronomical observations. He was sort of an astronomer, and among other things, and he was studying the stars as they traveled down the coast of South America. And he came, he came across what's called the Southern Cross, which you can only see south of the equator. And it's a constellation. And he wrote a letter back to Florence where he said that when he first viewed the Southern Cross, he was astounded by it. And he said the thing that immediately came to mind was a passage from Dante in the Purgatorio. And he quotes that passage in the letter he writes back to Florence. He says, "I turned to the right, and fixing my mind on the other pole, I saw 4 stars, not seen, but by those first on earth. The very second seemed to rejoice in their bright glittering. O widowed region of the north, denied that sight." So he uses the mind and the words of Dante to describe the incredible, the excitement of viewing the Southern Cross for the first time. So the final 2 things I want to cover. The question is creating something new out of a catastrophe. And I described what Boccaccio did, what Brunelleschi did, and others. Create, not just recognizing you're in a catastrophe, not just saying, how do we resist this? How do we maybe go back to, what it was like, 10 or 15 years ago? But recognizing that you are in, a civilizational crisis, if you look at these 2 things, what I call the 2 great interventions. Well, actually, I called Boccaccio's thing, but the two great interventions that were made, the 2 great creations. The intervention is the wrong word. The 2 great creations that were made at that time, was Dante's creation of the vernacular, of which the Commedia is obviously a phenomenal part, but Dante's creation of the vernacular and Brunelleschi's construction of the Dome of Florence based on new scientific principles. These created something new. Now, I'll just sort of say here, as sort of a pet peeve of mine, that I really believe, and I don't expect it to happen, I really believe that the word Renaissance should be abolished, because it gives an entirely false view of how Florence was rescued, how Italy was rescued, how Europe was rescued. The word Renaissance, as far as I know, was invented in the 19th century. No one, say at the time of the American Revolution, called what happened in Florence in the 15th century, Raphael, Leonardo, all these people, no one called that the Renaissance, as far as I know. The word Renaissance, the term Renaissance, at least as it applied to Italy, it came about in the 19th century, and it was popularized sort of by this sort of junior league oligarch, a patrician, named Jacob Burckhardt, who wrote a book which became very famous, called The Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy. And he published the book in 1860. And he was the one who first really put this moniker of Renaissance, what had occurred in Italy. And, in Renaissance is a French word, and it means rebirth or revival. And Burckhardt's entire argument, which really is still with us today, his entire argument was that this great resurgence of culture and science and creativity that occurred in Italy and then spread elsewhere in Europe, beginning in the 15th century, that this was all the result of the rediscovery of the ancient writings from mostly from Greek antiquity, some Latin, but mostly from Greek antiquity. That the writings of Plato, the writings of Homer, the playwrights, Aeschylus, all these people, that these had been brought into Europe and translated, and that it was this rediscovery of these ancient texts which created the Renaissance. And, in my view, there is not a word of truth in that, not a word of truth. First of all, the translations that began as people began to bring these texts from Constantinople and elsewhere, into Italy, this really didn't start in any kind of a way until after 1400. There were a few little things circulating, but until after 1400, and it didn't really get going in a big way until the 1420s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. Long after Dante, long after Boccaccio. Most of these translations were not done until after the Dome of Florence was already built. The resurgence in Plato, the resurgence in a lot of these writings, was a product of the Renaissance. It was a product of what was being created in Florence, which then spurred people towards these discoveries and this increase in knowledge. But it didn't create it, and this is an issue that Lyndon LaRouche often, argued about, where, he, what he discussed was what he called, what he called creation out of the blue, out of what appears to be thin air, but it's not out of thin air. It's out of the creative potential that already exists dormantly within every single human individual. That, what was done in Florence was not a revival of ancient learning. It was the creation of something that had never existed before. It was the creation of something new. And it's always when you're doing this, and Dante, writes about this over and over again when he's talking about love and the mind and the will. It's always that you're creating something, which is future oriented, in which you're creating new potentials and new possibilities, which never existed before. What I would argue and this is really, you see this in the Paradiso, but what I would argue here, and I know this is long because there's still something I'm going to read to you, but what I would argue here is that, this is actually the issue we're challenged with today, whether we realize it or not. We don't even have the base of the Dome of Florence yet, so we might have to start with the base. But we're like in a position like Brunelleschi. We need to create, a more powerful, a more human civilization, a more creative civilization than has ever existed before. And it's not exactly clear how to do it. It may take new discoveries, new potentialities. new people of courage to do this. But because you can't just look at where we are today. Look at Dante when he's writing the Commedia, when he's traveling around, when he's fighting the fight that he's fighting. The catastrophe is looming. It's looming. It's already beginning to break out. The culture is degraded and debased, degraded culture. The Lombard banking system is looting Europe. The famine is spreading. The death rate is rising, much like the world we're in today. But the crisis that had arisen in Dante's time, which was already beginning to break out, had not yet hit full force. It hit full force after he died. And he's writing for the future. He's saying, if you're going to overcome this crisis, you have to create something new. You have to create a society. And what he's doing with the vernacular is he's saying we have to increase the power, the morality and power and minds of the citizenry. This is what we have to do. We have to create new potentialities within the citizenry to overcome this crisis. And then you've got Boccaccio reading the Commedia to the people who were building the Florence Cathedral. So I do want to end with this. It's not that long, and then we'll open it up. Long class, I know, folks. I said last week that I was not going to read the end of the Paradiso, that I wasn't going to read the end of the Paradiso, and I'm not. But I'm going to read a section from the final canto, because really, I'm just talking here. And what I would prefer to do is to end this presentation with the words of Dante himself, to leave people in the right frame of mind. So in Canto 33, the final canto of Paradise, Dante writes, "O light, exalted beyond mortal thought, grant that in memory I see you again, but one small part of how you then appeared, and grant my tongue sufficient power that it may leave behind a single spark of glory for the people yet to come. Since, if you return but briefly to my mind, and then resound but softly in these lines, the better will your victory be conceived. I believe, from the keenness of the living ray that I endured, I would have been undone had I withdrawn my eyes from it. And I remember that on this account, I grew more bold, and thus sustained my gaze until I reached the goodness that is infinite. O plenitude of grace, by which I could presume to fix my eyes upon eternal light until my sight was spent on it. In its depth, I saw contained by love into a single volume bound, the pages scattered through the universe, substances, accidents, and the interplay between them, as though they were conflated in such ways that what I tell is but a simple light. I believe I understood the universal form of this dense knot, because I feel my joy expand, rejoicing as I speak of it. My memory of that moment is more lost than 25 centuries make dim that enterprise, when in wonder Neptune at Argo's shadow stared. Thus all my mind absorbed was gazing, fixed, unmoving, and intent, becoming more enraptured in its gazing. He who beholds that light is so enthralled that he would never willingly consent to turn away from it for any other sight, because the good that is the object of the will is held and gathered in perfection there that elsewhere would imperfect show. So I hope people have hung in there. And that is what I wanted to present tonight, folks. Okay?